Hello and welcome. My name is Steven Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and this is Scholarly Snippets, Season 2, Episode 1. Scholarly Snippets is my show where I interview people with history degrees or related degrees in order to shed light on the world of history and historical scholarship. Today I'm joined by Dr. Sean Munger. He received a bachelor's in history from the University of New Mexico in 1993, a master's in history from the University of Oregon in 2012, and a PhD in history from the same university in 2017. He teaches online courses about conspiracy theories in America, Vladimir Putin, Pearl Harbor, and more. He runs 2 podcasts. One is Green Screen, a dive into pop movies focused on the environment, and the other is Second Decade, an exploration of true stories from the 1810s. He also runs the Sean Munger YouTube channel and is the author of 6 books, 5 of them fiction and 1 nonfiction. You can learn more about him on his website at seanmunger.com. As you watch this interview, think of questions that you would have asked that I didn't. Then comment those questions so I can get a better view of what you want to hear from my guests. Without further ado, here's the interview. Sean, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule to have this conversation. How are you doing?
Okay. Pretty good. Thanks for inviting me.
That's very good to hear, and you're welcome for the invite. You're a PhD historian. You've got quite a bit of experience in the field. You have a YouTube channel that I've been watching. Could you tell us a little bit about history? What is history? What are we talking about here?
Well, history is a big subject. I mean, there's the technical definition that history is anything that happened in the past, but I think kind of more fundamentally, it's an attempt to explain the past. It's something that we create and use to figure out how we got here and who we are and what things we care about as people and as a society. So I think there's a little bit of, I mean, history is as a fact what it is, but I think the sort of discipline of history or the doing of history has more of a component of identity to it, of explaining what's important about the past and understanding it in terms that we can use it for the future. So I don't think there's a real specific definition beyond that. It's so broad that there's so many different things you can do with history, that trying to put it in one specific box, I think, is hard.
Right. So we've got the regular conception of history is everything that's happened. Things have happened. We know that. And then there's the more technical academic definition where it's the discipline of history and looking into it, understanding it. How does it impact us? How can we use it to influence the future? So thanks for sharing that. What makes someone a historian? Where's the line between layperson and historian?
Well, again, I think it depends on whether you're talking about the discipline of history, in which case there's certain credentials or whatever. But I think there are many people who are historians who don't have degrees or a specific status within an institution. I think it's someone who engages responsibly with the past and makes an intellectually honest attempt to uh, come to terms with it and to understand it. Uh, so there's historians who do all kinds of history. There's not just talking about people who do research and write books, but there are, of course, art historians and visual historians and music historians and people who probably wouldn't recognize that they do history in the things that they do. I am acquainted with a musician in Germany who plays a lot of Middle Eastern instruments. So he plays like the oud and like other stringed instruments from Iranian culture or Iraqi culture. And he does not identify with a historian, but he does a lot of like reinterpretation of traditional Middle Eastern songs or whatever with those kinds of instruments. And so you could argue that he's a historian because he's kind of bringing these uh, pieces of music from the past into a modern context and trying to understand them and kind of explain them. So just as the definition of history is broad, I think the definition of historian is broad. But I would say that it does take, it's not just anyone who's talking about the past in any context. I think there has to be an actual engagement with, and an honest engagement with uh, what happened in the past, what it means, and how we explain it.
So, in your opinion, it's anybody who is responsibly approaching the study of the past and doing that honestly and studying it. And you're right, history is incredibly broad. There's fire historians who study specifically just the history of different fires, which is interesting. How would you explain your field? What is your specialty in history?
Well, I'm kind of a generalist. I sort of have to be because I'm not, employed in an academic institution, so I don't have a really narrow focus. I've done a lot of history in a certain number of areas. I'm probably most well known for my podcast Second Decade, which is about the 18 teens, and also kind of environmental history. Those are both areas that I tended to focus on in my academic study when I was getting my PhD. So, of course, I'm kind of pretty well grounded in them. But I also do a lot of things. I teach history, and I have a number of classes in. I teach U.S. history. I teach a pre-modern world history. I teach world history. I do a lot of kind of freelance and one-off classes on a number of subjects in both modern and not so modern history. So I tend to gravitate toward environmental history, but I certainly don't remain exclusively within that. So I really am interested in that period in the early 19th century, which I find very fascinating. But also, I've done a lot of stuff, and you can see much of this on my YouTube channel, where I do some, very modern stuff, modern politics and the presidency and things like that. Um, I've got a course that's on my website right now about the history of conspiracy theories, which is a very fascinating subject. I've always been interested in what I call organized deception. So scams, cults, and conspiracy theories have been of interest to me. I just have kind of a weird nautical interest as well. So particularly on my Twitter, I'll post, you know, pictures of staterooms from 20th century ocean liners and things like that. So there's a lot of different things that I'm interested in. And I can be enough of a generalist where I can kind of go in those various directions and not be as tied to one specific subject or one specific area. So there's, good things and bad things about being sort of a freelance historian. But one of the good things is I can sort of indulge my tastes and hit a lot of different types of subjects rather than being tied to just one.
So it sounds like you have deep interest in modern history from 1800s forward,
Hmm.
but you are quite general, getting nautical history, conspiracy theories thrown in there. I have watched your conspiracy videos on YouTube. It's somewhat of an encyclopedic collection of conspiracy theories, so that's interesting to look through. There's a few in there that I hadn't even heard about. How do you define historiography? What is that?
Well, I think historiography is, I mean, the technical definition is it's the history of history. It's about how historical narratives have been written in the past, how they've changed over time, and how we engage with them. I think historiography is often invisible to most people who aren't professional historians because I think a lot of people have a misconception that history is sort of set, that it's like mowing a lawn that never grows, basically. Like you go over a patch of the past and you figure out what the facts are that happened, and then once you've mowed that patch of lawn, it's done forever. And I think people don't realize that history is a process of debate, really. And um, I find this with my middle school students, particularly. They're often kind of amazed that historians don't know. I mean, there's no specific answer to something like, what caused the Crusades? What were the Crusades about? And of course, that's a topic that's been very hotly debated in historiography for the last, several hundred years, really. Um, so I think historiography is kind of the process of how we tell stories about the past, what we're trying to get at, why we choose to look at certain subjects or investigate them or try to figure out the explanations behind them. It can be a contentious process. It can be somewhat boring. I was always bored by my historiography courses in both undergrad and graduate school, but it is interesting when you find it about a topic that you like and see how it's changed. So there's some good things about it.
So, historiography is traditionally kind of known as the history of history, but more so it's the study of how historians have written their history, how things have changed over time, what methods they used,
Mhm,
if I'm
mhm.
understanding that correctly.
Right, and I think a lot of historiography, again, people don't realize that they're engaging in it. Right now the whole moral panic about critical race theory, which is largely ginned up for political reasons, is a form of historiography. It's talking about what do we emphasize in American history, what is not appropriate to emphasize, is history slanted or that sort of thing. Those are all they usually are historiography type debates that people who wouldn't consider themselves historians or doing historiography often engage in. So it kind of comes up in a lot of contexts that people don't expect it to come up in.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, critical race theory is very prominent in historical discussions today on what types of lenses are we going to use to look at the past, and so yeah, historiography. It's that's a good way of looking at it. Is how are we going to look at the past? What types of ideas are we going to use? So, what influences are there on how we're going to write about this? So, yeah, it is interesting. What sort of methods do we have to look into the past? How do you define historical method?
I think there's so many of them that are valid. I mean, the traditional method, the one that you get in, graduate school, is you go into the documentary history and you look up what the facts were and what the evidence is, and heavy use of primary sources from the time that you're talking about, from people who were there. But I think there's a lot of good historical methods as well that go beyond that. I gave the example of the guy who plays the Middle Eastern music, and seeing what kinds of musical traditions there are, listening to stories. That's been a huge part of uh, American history that's been kind of under the surface for the last several decades. There's been numerous projects, many sponsored by the federal government, of oral history projects, of getting interviews with, like, there was a big project of people who lived through the Depression, and there's a World War II veterans oral project. I was involved in one of those a couple of years ago. um, Much earlier, when there were people still alive who were still alive at the time of slavery, there was a concerted effort to record the stories of people who had been slaves or whose parents had been slaves. So those are all good historical methods. I think intellectually, the again, kind of the hallmark of historical method is a responsible approach. You have to go in understanding that the facts you may find might surprise you, or they might indicate something happened totally different than you think it did, or the causes behind it might be different, and you have to engage with those honestly. Um, and I think there's a certain logic and rational process to it as well, which is what separates uh, true history from pseudo history, where you have to really understand the logic behind certain things and how evidence works, and what are logical conclusions to reach, or logical ways of thinking about something that happened in the past, and not be constrained by a particular bias or a particular desire to reach a certain conclusion. So I think all of that is sort of mixed together in historical method.
Thanks for sharing. My next question was going to be about pseudo history and how do you define that, but it sounds like you kind of covered that already. You just said basically, from what I heard, is that pseudo history is a misuse of historical method, it's a dishonest engagement. Or
Mhm.
I don't know though, because I've come across things that are called pseudo history, and it's difficult to tell if the person's being dishonest. To accuse them of that, definitely, I would put more emphasis on flawed methodology
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
results in pseudo history, maybe not a intentional deception.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I think it's possible to be both an honest and a dishonest pseudo historian. There are a lot of people who engage in pseudo history with honest motives, um, but as you point out, use sort of uh, flawed methods or flawed premises. I get into this a lot. I do a lot of pseudo history and talking about pseudo history, particularly on my YouTube channel, um, which it tends to get somewhat heated sometimes when you attack uh, narratives that people are deeply wedded to. The probably one of the prime examples, at least that I've done, is the whole Oak Island buried treasure myth in Canada. Those are flawed methods where people will look at things that happened in the past or are said to have happened in the past and reach a conclusion about how, oh, well, pirates must have buried something on this island centuries ago, and it turns out that the pieces of evidence they're relying on are not reliable, or are flat out fabricated or whatever. And there can be honest uh, misunderstanding of how those things work. But as you point out, the line between dishonesty and honest misappropriation of history lies in flawed methods. So I think pseudo history, it's a really big subject, and there's a lot of uh, different motives within it. There's often a motive for financial gain, or popularity, because pseudo history tends to be much more popular than real history, and you see that, like, that's why the History Channel is so prominent. Um, so I think there's a lot of different motives, but I think kind of what cuts across all of them is some sort of flawed methodology, or some sort of flawed reasoning about what is evidence, what is reliable evidence, what is logical progression. How do we think about things that happened in the past in a rational way? Pseudo historians really tend toward the irrational, um, much more so, I think, than real historians do. So I think that's a hallmark of pseudo histories. It's marked by irrationality, whether honestly committed or dishonestly done for whatever reason.
Yeah, so flawed methodology, irrational conclusions, maybe they're being dishonest for whatever reason, entertainment or
Mhm.
popularity or some nefarious goal. But so, yeah, thanks for sharing what your thoughts are on pseudo history. I feel like we've covered some sort of the basic terminology that we come across in history. I want to get down to your roots. What originally got you interested in history?
Oh, that's so hard to say, because I just feel like I've just lived in it through my whole life. Really, ever since I was a child, I was always interested in things that happened in the past, and there's kind of an imagination component to it. I've always been a pretty imaginative person, and sort of thinking about the way the world was, or certain events were, long ago, where it's a totally different world and the people acted differently and everything looked different and everything worked differently, um, was really a fascinating sort of escape from reality, and also kind of an intellectual exercise. Why did people make these decisions in the past that seem crazy to us now, but seem completely rational to them? And you have to kind of put yourself in the way that they thought back then.
Well,
Um,
I want to interject and
yeah.
say, even currently, that is a useful skill. With your most recent installment of the conspiracy, I think it's episode 5, or I can't remember what you call it, session 5 or something,
Hmm.
but you talk about the Heaven's Gate cult and understanding what they were thinking and what they were going through to engage in those practices is, I think, beneficial for our own use. And it's not too far removed. It was just, well, I guess it is 2021 now, so that was
Yeah.
over
So
20 years ago,
20 some
but
years ago. Yeah. It seems
still,
like yesterday.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, even for recent times, much less going back 200 years or
Hmm.
2,000 years, there's a lot to learn.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So I've always really been attracted to that kind of escaping into another world and trying to understand it and explain it. I find fascinating. I do a fair amount of medieval history, and I find that very interesting because I find the people so hard to understand. It's Lots of medieval people did things in their just normal lives that are unthinkable to us today, but seem completely normal to them.
What's
And
an example of one of those things?
well, when you read, like in Byzantine history, particularly some of the royal families, um, would do terrible things to their own family members. Princess Irena had her son blinded with boiled lead poured into his eyeballs, and how could you do that to your own son? And other, just kind of normal medieval people were casual about violence or death in their early lives, in their daily lives, and yet they weren't monsters. I mean, they weren't sociopaths, which is what you would have to be to do certain things that, uh, if they were done today, that's the explanation you would reach for. I'm also thinking, like, a good example would be infanticide in the Roman Empire. Uh, Murder was the leading cause of death among young children in ancient Rome, because infanticide was very casual, and they would just do it for reasons like, yeah, well, we don't have a whole lot of, we're a little low on food this week, so I guess I'll kill my daughter. And it's like, how could you do? I mean, that kind of thing is unthinkable to us today unless you have something severely wrong with you. And yet that was a fairly casual decision in Roman times.
Does so that differs from abortion, where
Hmm.
infanticide is killing a child that's already been born.
Hmm. Right, right, right. Yeah. Um, so kind of, putting yourself again, trying to think through what was their world like that made those decisions like that, and also comparing them to today. We make decisions in our daily lives that at some point in the future will probably be considered monstrous, and we make them very casually. um, Perhaps related to the environment, or participation in certain economic activities or whatever. So we're not immune to those things, but I think thinking about how people thought differently in the past is a really interesting and valid exercise, um, and one that sort of stretches your mind a little bit, um, in some important ways. In my childhood, I was very interested in movies or TV shows that took place in the past, and thinking about, well, why was it like that, and why did they build their society like that, and why did they make these decisions, and so I guess it was just trying to kind of this understand these other worlds, both physical and intellectual, that people in the past lived in, and try to make sense of them.
It sounds like you were really taken in by the exploration of causation. What caused these things to happen? What were the consequences of people's actions? And I think this was all based on what originally got you interested in history, that question I asked. So,
Hmm.
yeah, it was a lifelong pursuit of interest in causes and consequences. So,
Yeah.
thanks for sharing that. When did you get your PhD again?
My PhD was awarded in 2017. I had kind of an unconventional career path because I had a undergraduate, bachelor's degree in history when I first went to college, and then I went to law school and practiced law
When was the
for a number of years.
bachelor's?
That was in the early 90s.
Hmm.
So, yeah, 93, I guess, was my bachelor's. So then I went to law school, practiced law for a number of years, and then kind of took a respite from my legal career and went back to school in 2010 to get my PhD and sort of pursue my first love, which was history. So I kind of came about it in a roundabout way that is not real common with a lot of other academics.
What is common, though, from what I've heard, is history students going into law and vice
Yeah,
versa. There's a lot of layover there, having
right.
to analyze documents, understand what actions have been committed. So
Mhm.
that's interesting. I was just wondering because I'm curious about you've been in it, you got your bachelor's in the 90s, you've just got your PhD about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years
Mhm.
ago now. What's been your favorite part of it so far? It's been a long road.
Oh, it has been a long road. Um, I really do enjoy teaching, and I like doing the online classes, which are not just examples that you see on my YouTube, but I've taught a number of online classes on my website, and then also in seminars and webinars and that sort of thing. Um, so a lot of my teaching experience, at least before I a couple of years ago got one of the gigs I have now, which is teaching middle school, which is wonderful because they're blank slates. I mean, they know nothing about history at all. So you can kind of mold their interest in historical topics in a way that you can't with other people. But so teaching the kids is great. Teaching the senior citizens, which has been, I've done a lot of classes for seniors, and those are just wonderful because they always have a lot of really interesting things to say or personal stories to bring to whatever they're talking about, and kind of conveying information and engaging people in ways that um, they otherwise wouldn't have had, I think is really rewarding. So I really enjoy that. One of several of the most fun things that I've done in my historical career involved my research for my dissertation, where I did research at a number of really interesting institutions like the Huntington Library in California or the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. Uh, One of the big thrills that I got, a story I love to tell from my Massachusetts Historical Society days, was getting to read and handle a book that was written by Thomas Jefferson. Like, not a copy, not photos, but they gave me the actual physical book that he wrote. And not just him, there were others. A lot of my research, and this goes back to my work on the second decade of the 19th century. A lot of my research involved diaries and handwritten documents, stuff that would never be digitized. You could never find it online. But these ancient diaries and journals that have been held in archives, just from ordinary people or semi-famous people, uh, and they've never really been cataloged or whatever. And so you have to go through them page by page. And some of the discoveries that I found in some of those sources were a lot of fun and a lot of really interesting. I'm thinking particularly of, there was a diary of a student who went to Harvard in, I think, 1815. And college students at that time in the early 19th century weren't like the ages that most people go to college today. It's like they tended to be young teenagers and like like what we would call high school age people today. So this kid was 16, I think he was 15, 16, 17 when he started writing this diary, and he had a very weird, kind of strange sense of humor. He was not didn't have a lot of friends. So he was this kind of awkward misfit and just writing about his day-to-day life. And, none of this, I mean, a little bit of it ended up in my dissertation, but the parts that didn't, like, he went to a party and got drunk for the first time in his life. And he wrote about that experience. So that was, really interesting and kind of funny to read, to get caught up in this story. There was another diary that I read, which was written by a composer, I believe, and I can't remember his name, but he was from England, and this was in the 18 teens, and his wife was chronically ill for a number of years. And so I got reading his diary and I became very emotionally invested in what was happening to his wife. And, like, every page I'm like turning the page and I'm like, oh gosh, she's going to die. She's going to die. She's going to die. She's going to die. And, turn the page and it's like, oh, she's still alive. And then, something else happens or whatever. And then she starts to recover and then she starts to decline again. And so you get kind of invested in these sorts of things.
You
So
got
I
me
would say,
tearing up a little bit just hearing about it.
oh, totally. Yeah, it's really amazing. There was another diary that I found from a woman who was apparently a lesbian. This was in the 18 teens, and she had started to write about a relationship that she was having with another woman. And I mean, there was nothing explicit in the journal, but it was very clear that this was a romantic and sexual relationship. And then turning a page over and seeing that there had been significant portions of the next page that were erased, probably by someone else, probably not by the writer of the journal, but by someone else. And they had used in the 19th century, they didn't have pencil erasers like we have today. So what they would do is they would, like, scrape off the top layer of the paper. And so there were, like, these weird, like, deep scored uh, trenches in the page that obscured certain parts of the narrative. And I'm like, well, who did that, or why did they do that? Um, was very interesting. I remember in the Huntington Library, there was a source that had absolutely nothing. I mean, I was researching weather and climate history, so this is nothing I was seeking out, but there was an unexpected page of pornographic drawings that I found in a book, a bunch of dirty cartoons dated 1835. I thought that was really fun and interesting. So you find these interesting little discoveries, things that you would never have expected, never have looked for, could never find, even if you were looking for them deliberately. So I think those are among the most fun things that I found in my study.
So, to summarize all that, your two favorite things in your field so far have been the teaching, being able to connect with others from middle school students to senior citizens. And then the second thing is the archival work of getting to go through these old documents, reading people's diaries from 200 years ago now. And yeah, researching climate and climate history, and then stumbling across people's love life and their married life. So yeah, that's all very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. What have been the challenging aspects of it?
Well, within the profession of history, of course, the elephant in the room is that there's the profession of history doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, there's no tenure track jobs. The ways to earn a living at teaching or doing history are all kind of guerrilla gig economy type of engagements these days. So I would say the most frustrating is going through that whole process of getting a PhD, and sort of the machinery within that academic process is geared toward a professional world that doesn't exist anymore. The idea of you're going to go for interviews at universities and you have this body of work and this is how you apply to jobs and this is, the tenure track and things like that. And that largely doesn't exist anymore. I mean, there's a vanishingly few number of those jobs left, but the vast majority of people who are historians with credentials are not going to end up working in those kinds of jobs. So I guess the kind of the most frustrating is figuring out how to use it in a way where it doesn't feel like you've wasted years of your life, getting these advanced degrees and doing all this study and then not being able to do something with it. So I'd say that's the most frustrating part of it.
So, financial support, finding employment is a challenge to overcome, and
Right.
then
Right.
beating that nagging sense of wasting time. Is this was that worth it? Did I mess up? That's another challenge to overcome, and
Yeah.
yeah, I think
Well,
those are common.
yeah, and I think it's easy to misstate or overstate those challenges because I think people really do value history. I mean, history has always been popular. People always love it. They're always interested in it. So people value history, but our economy does not. And so there's a disconnect there where I think ordinary people and even institutions have a great value on history, but the way our economy is structured is not built to capture that kind of value. So I find that to be very frustrating. And again, this kind of gets back into pseudo history. History Channel is successful financially largely because they tell false narratives about the past. Because people want to hear about ancient aliens and these ridiculous twistings of real history because you can sell advertising and make that pay. Whereas I mean, if you have two books, one that claims that aliens built the pyramids, that book is going to be a bestseller. But if you write an actual scholarly history about how the pyramids were really built, you're going to sell four copies. So, our economy and our system is structured to not capture the value that historians create within society, and I find that very frustrating.
There has been a lot of fear or a lot of anger on Twitter as of recently with a new, I haven't looked into it yet, but a new show about Atlantis. And
Ugh.
the archaeologists are up in arms about this network not actually having expert archaeologists on. So, hey, yeah,
Yeah.
that's another example of what you're talking about here. You're a generalist in history. What types of books or articles would you like? What's maybe the top book that you would recommend somebody look into if they want to learn about history,
Oh
even if
gosh,
it's only
it's
sold 4 copies?
it's so hard to narrow down just one.
What about two? That make it easier.
Yeah, I guess well, maybe a little bit easier. There's a really wonderful book um, that I was just enchanted by when I first read it in graduate school, and it's called Nature's Metropolis, and it's an environmental history of Chicago. And I know that sounds completely arcane. I have a copy of it somewhere in my oh, there it is, but it's underneath the table back there. But it's by William Cronin, who was one of the chief kind of founders really of the genre of environmental history. It's an amazing book because it talks about so many different things that you would never think of in the history of Chicago about what was happening on the waterfront and how pigs were crucial to the development of Chicago and how the stock market worked. And like in the 1850s there was this weird financial system based on grain, and there were like grain elevators, and then brokers would trade notes for you know 2 bushels of grain that came out of this elevator or whatever, and there was like an economy that grew up around that, and how that sort of radiated outward and really built the city of Chicago. I found it enchanting because it made things that you would think are not useless but very arcane and dull. It made those into really interesting and exciting topics, stuff that you would never think would be exciting. So I would recommend that book. There's lots of popular history books that I think, even though they are, there's some professional historians have a disdain for popular history. I do like a lot of popular history books, and there are some that are just wonderful journeys filled with a lot of really interesting stuff. The stuff that Robert K. Massey has written over the years has been wonderful. Nicholas and Alexandra, for example, which was published more than 50 years ago, is one of the great history books of the last century, I think, and really gets into the meat of not just their personal relationship with the Russian royal family and World War I and what was happening in that whole era. So I find that a very engaging book too. Another book that you could read and then you want to read more. It's like there's so many questions that come up and so many interesting things that come out of reading a book like that that it makes you seek out more information. So I think those are the best history books. Those are the ones that do that kind of thing.
Sweet. Thanks for sharing that. Again, just to recap, you got your bachelor's in the 90s and have kind of been in and out of history since then, PhD in 2017. What are some changes that you've seen in the field of history?
I think the field of history has become more nuanced and democratized, I guess. Um, there are certain frustrations that come along with that because, again, the field of academic history lags behind the reality of what people are doing in the field of history. Uh, there's now, particularly in American and European history, so much more focus on stories or people or narratives who have typically been either ignored or minimized. There's been so much work done on slavery or Native Americans or peasants in medieval Europe and those kinds of things. So those stories are now of heavy interest to uh, historians. The field of women's history, which has been obviously around for a long time, but has really become extremely vibrant in the last 50 years. And then a microcosm of that would be LGBT history, which has become extremely vibrant in the last 10 to 20 years. Um, so it's good to see that people who are in those kinds of fields of history now have a prominence that those kinds of historians did not have in decades past. Again, I'm taking kind of a longer view. In a shorter view, one of the things that's changed that I think is an enormously positive change is the availability of sources, particularly electronic and digital sources. Even when I was doing my dissertation, I had to travel to archives to get, and we're not talking, obviously things like the journals and things like that are going to be held in archives and not digitized. But even when we're talking about books, like published books that are fairly obscure, um, the availability of those kinds of things has really exploded, particularly in the last 5 years or so. uh, I've been doing my podcast Second Decade for, I guess, for almost 5 years now. I started doing it when I was still working on my dissertation and had access to my university library. And so I could basically get kind of any book I wanted on a particular subject. And then after I got my degree, has to do with the availability of journals and the economic stranglehold, particularly on academic publishing, that certain uh, you know academic publishers have with access to electronic databases and things like that. They sort of throttle you once you leave the academy. If you're not employed as a faculty member, you will lose access to all of that, which I did and you can tell, like, if you go through the back catalog of my podcast, Second Decade, you can tell 2018 is when I lost my access because my uh, volume of episodes really uh, went down to a minimum, and it was much harder to get sources and things like that. And that has been getting much better because you can now find more books online than you used to be able to. The website archive.org is absolutely incredible with the stuff that you can get for free from libraries all over the world. So those kinds of like access to sources has been getting a lot better just in a very, very short period of time. So that's a change that I would say has happened fairly recently.
I would say JSTOR too has a lot of older journals and magazines that
Oh
are
yeah,
on there with digitized access to them. So that's very
right.
useful as well.
And JSTOR, which I used to, I mean, I love the stuff that's on JSTOR, but the JSTOR company I hated because they wanted to throttle access. They wanted to monetize access basically. And this is one of the positive changes in the pandemic, because when the pandemic hit, they realized that people couldn't go to their libraries, even academics couldn't go to their university libraries to access, because a lot of these sources, they have access like on campuses, so you have to go to a university library to get access to the database or whatever. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, JSTOR offered, you had to sign up, but they offered access for free to a vast amount of their
Well,
archives.
I remember that. It was prior to the pandemic, they were allowing you 20 free article views,
Right.
and then after it, they started allowing 100, which
Right.
was a lot more.
Yeah,
Of,
and they said that, oh, this is going to last for the time of the pandemic, but of course that was when we thought the pandemic was going to last 6 months and not the probably 3 or 4 years that it looks likely to last. And so that the access is still there, and I know that they're not the only people that have done something like that. So that's been a good thing, and I don't think they're going to go back. I think now, the pandemic has changed our behavior enough that those economic models are starting to break down, and I think that's a very positive thing.
there is quite a bit of controversy about archive.org, though. I've seen people complaining about the copyrighted material on there that shouldn't be on there. So there's a dispute to be had about what should be monetized, what shouldn't be monetized, which leads into my next question. What do you feel is the most controversial thing in the field of history right now? What kind of controversial discussions are being had?
Oh well, I think the obvious one we've talked about is the idea of critical race theory, which is something of a chimera because it's not a good faith discussion. I mean, the people who are opposed to what they think, I mean, they don't really know what, most of the critics of critical race theory don't really know what it is.
Do you know what it is? Could
I
could you
do, but
summarize it?
well, it's a fairly narrow uh, theoretical construct of how institutions work and how racial issues sort of influence how institutions work, basically. I mean, there's a certain small subset of historians who developed that theory, but the people out in the rank and file universe, the vast majority of them who are talking about what they think is critical race theory, are not really talking about that specific theory. They're talking about the idea of teaching or acknowledging that racism has had an effect in both institutions and throughout American history. In the most extreme cases, people have been politicizing that and using critique of critical race theory as a way to terminate any discussion about race that they don't like. So that's why I say it's not a good faith debate about a historical topic. It's a political drum to beat, basically. It's a culture war issue. So I mean, that's controversial right now, but it's disingenuous in the sense that it's not really about history. It's about politics and culture war type of things. I think that there are some controversial topics when dealing with certain subjects. Environmental history, there's lots of controversy, particularly about, like, I study climate change a lot, and there's been a lot of work being done just recently about uh, governmental and institutional complicity in not just neglecting the idea and the issues of global warming, but actively causing them. I know Gus Speth just had a book that came out recently within the last month or so that's all about that topic. I have also done some research on that. Um, those are opinions that are, that's historical work that is controversial, I think, because of a political controversy as well. So there's all kinds of controversies. They change. Some last longer than others. And then there's sort of a subset of controversial opinions or fields that uh, exist kind of within pretty much an academic, uh, kind of an academic milieu that doesn't really filter out into the non-academic universe. I'm thinking of the field of genocide studies, which I took a class on that in graduate school. That's a thicket because professional, academic historians who want to talk about genocide will usually start by asking the question, well, what is genocide? And then they never get past that question. And it's all an argument about, well, how do you define genocide? And, those type, and is A genocide, or is B a genocide, or is C not a genocide? That's not really a debate that you see in the real world as often as you see it in academia. So there's opinions like that. Um, those sorts of things. And then there's the opinions of historians that contradict sort of casual opinions held by large numbers of non-historians. Um, I find this happens when you talk about appeasement, for example. Everyone thinks they know they understand what appeasement was right before World War II, but if you get into the actual historical facts of it, it turned out to be a much more complicated story than most people think. And it also, talk about a controversial opinion. The policies that Neville Chamberlain was pursuing at the end of 1938 were largely reasonable and politically very popular policies. And a lot of people who don't get into the fine grain of what was really happening and what was really going on at that time don't really understand that is how it was working. So that would be, an example of a controversial opinion, I guess, that appeasement was a reasonable policy. You're never going to find a politician who makes that case, but there's plenty of historians. Well, I will name one politician who made that case, who, when he was a historian, that being John F. Kennedy, who wrote a book about it. But kind of going off on a tangent at this point. So
Right. So to summarize all that, the main thing you brought up first was critical race theory is controversial, not because of critical race theory itself, but because of these straw men that are being used for political purposes. You got into climate change. I'm surprised you didn't mention climate change denialism. That is somewhat controversial. Then you went and talked about a few different genocide. You talked about appeasement, which it sounds like, each subfield of history has its discussions, its debates that are going on right now. So I appreciate you sharing all that. Are there any controversial opinions that you hold that stick out?
well, if you look at the comments on my YouTube page, I guess the idea that there's no treasure on Oak Island would be a controversial opinion, at least among some people. Yeah, I don't know that that I really champion one or another a particular uh, controversial opinion. Um, I will touch, because I am a generalist. I kind of touch different topics in a lot of different ways. Um, I have my opinions about. I try not to deal too much with the Civil War military history, because there's a large number of uh, kind of amateur historians who like to grind a lot of axes within that realm. Often, kind of middle-aged white men who are champions of a particular military commander, and if you mention the words George McClellan on Twitter, you're going to get some blowback from somebody who's a fan of him. I mean, stuff like that,
Y'all
which
be
is
nice in the
fairly,
comments on this video. He
yeah.
just name dropped, so I know they're going to be rolling in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's kind of low level controversies like that, but I wouldn't say that I have a particularly controversial outlook on history in general, or a particular opinion that I'm known for that is known to be controversial outside of these small niche topics that I sometimes touch.
See, I don't know if there is treasure on Oak Island, but I like the idea that I could take a shovel out there and find some. So I don't
Well,
know if I like what you're saying about
yeah.
that. You got your PhD in 2017. Do you have any desire to get another degree? And if so, what would it be?
No, I think I have enough degrees because I got my undergraduate in history. I got an MA technically on the road to my PhD, and I also have a law degree. So I think I've spent enough time in school over the course of my lifetime. No desire to go back.
That's understandable. You mentioned that you're working on some classes, making some webinars. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I always have classes that I will put on my website, and often these will be done in conjunction with specific webinars that I'll do for particular audiences. So I'm working on one right now that's about the history of the U.S. presidency seen through the prism of place. So Mount Vernon or Monticello, what can those places tell us about Washington or Jefferson?
What about Mount Rushmore?
Well, yeah, I mean, not so. Mount Rushmore is more of a memorial, but I'm talking about places that are associated with particular presidents' birthplaces, or the places they got their education, or the pub that Bill Clinton used to hang out in when he was at Oxford, or the the school that Barack Obama went to in Honolulu, which was very formative in his life, and very formative because of the diverse people who went to that school when he was in seventh and eighth grade. Those kinds of I've been developing a class based around that kind of approach. So I'm working on that. I have some plans for various other classes. People have been wanting to see my American Revolution class again, which I gave first online about 4 years ago, and so that would be an interesting one to do. So I've got that. I've got that too. I've got some historical projects in the works, kind of a long-term project about the biography of a young German during the World War II era who was accused of being a spy, and his bizarre life story. He impersonated a U.S. serviceman. Uh, had just a really strange life story that's kind of like a real life spy thriller, and I am one of the first historians to really look into his story. That's a longer term project, so I'm kind of working on those. Also, I write fiction, so I'm working on some novels as well. So I'm always working on something.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got a lot of spinning plates
Yeah,
on
indeed.
stage. So, yep, we're getting towards the end of the episode. This is the part where I give everybody a chance to leave a message for people who are just interested in history. They haven't pursued it critically yet, or through an institution, or they're starting to foster their interest. What message do you give to those people who are new to the field?
Well, I would say definitely pursue what you're interested in. It can be tremendously rewarding and fascinating and lead to some really interesting things. Um, I would say don't do it because you want to become a professional, academic historian, because of obviously the major problems that are we're now working through in the field of history as a profession. But if you are interested in history, it is worthwhile. Society does value it, and I think there's a lot of it's much better to do something that you have a personal interest and personal investment in than to pursue something just because it's economically useful or you think you can get a job or whatever. So the people who have a genuine interest in history, I would not want to do anything to dissuade them from pursuing that interest, despite the challenges that exist. It really is a fascinating way to think and a fascinating thing to bring into your life. So enjoy it, I guess, would be the main advice I would give.
So find something that you're interested in, find something enjoyable to you. Don't be dissuaded from the challenges. They can be overcome, and stick with it.
Yeah.
Great. Sean, thanks for joining me. Can you give everyone a little bit on where to find you, how to find your content?
Sure. My main website is just seanmunger.com, and you can find my classes and the stuff that I do mainly showcased there. My email is sean at seanmunger.com. I have a YouTube channel, as you pointed out, and I also have some podcasts. So my podcasts are Second Decade, which is specifically historical show that's available on the major podcatchers. I'm also the producer and co-host of a podcast called Green Screen, which is about movies actually, but there's a lot of environmental history in there as well. So we'll deal with movies about the environment and talk about the historical issues involved with them. That's also on the major podcatchers too.
Cool. Links to all that will be in the description of this video, so be sure to go check out Sean's website, his YouTube channel. And again, Sean, thanks for joining me. I've had a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. Fun. Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. I reached out to Sean after the interview to ask him about the opening quote at the beginning of this episode. I asked how much of it he agrees with and what dangers can come from people who don't know much about scholars and historians speaking as if they did. He said, "I generally agree with the quote, and I think your articulation of the dangers that come from it is pretty good. I would highlight one particular danger of uninformed and irresponsible discussion of history. The use of it to construct false narratives about the past which can be weaponized into harmful political and social agendas. For example, many people think of pseudo-history as relatively fun and harmless, like ancient aliens theories. This theory, however, is deeply racist and was developed and popularized by literal Nazis. By literal, I mean the people who worked for the German NDSAP between 1933 and 1945. This would certainly be an example of the kind of danger that Mamigliano is talking about." Thank you, Sean, for your insightful response. For everyone else, be sure to drop any other questions in the comments section that you wish I had asked Sean. Before I go, I owe the Ctruth patrons a huge thanks for their continued support in my endeavor to explore and map the world of chronology. Thank you all. And check out these other videos while you're here.